Our guest speaker this morning, when he thinks of adventure, he thinks of mountains too. Not quite what we have behind us, but he thinks of mountains as well. In 1924, George Lee Mallory was the man who said, "Because it's there," when asked why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. He also called Everest the struggle of life itself, upwards and forever upwards. Just getting to the base camp of Everest has its ups and downs. It's a 3-week trek over 150 miles. Those adventurers will climb 44,000 vertical feet and descend 30,000 vertical feet just to climb 14,000 feet to get to the base camp. 150-mile hike. And for over 30 years, he's led adventures and expeditions to remote regions of northern Norway, Peru, Nepal, China, and Greenland. He's explored areas of the Arctic on 6 occasions, making many first ascents of previously unclimbed peaks. He was recently in the Antarctic on the 100th anniversary of the first successful British exploration in 1912. In 1965, at the age of 20, he spent 2 weeks lashed to tiny ledges while making the first ever ascent of Europe's highest and steepest mountain precipice, the 5,000-foot vertical mile, Troll Wall, Norway. Imagine looking up 1 mile. In 1966, he led an adventure to climb South America's most beautiful mountain, Alpamayo in Peru. And in 1981, he led an expedition of China's I'm going to burn this, Mutsga-Ata, skiing both up and down the mountain. But that was just a practice run for Everest. In 1989, our guest led another successful expedition, staying a little bit closer to the Earth, tracing the route taken by Sir Alexander Mackenzie in his trek across Canada 200 years early. He did it on the 200th anniversary. Mackenzie successfully crossed the continent 13 years before Lewis and Clark, for those folks out there who are the historical buffs. They did this in canoes, trekking across North America in canoes. Our guest has made over 1,800 keynote addresses in front of audiences across the world. He's a former school teacher and mountain guide, and we are fortunate to have the opportunity to listen to his incredible stories and how they relate to our everyday challenges. Kelly mentioned he has copies of his book for sale outside of the conference room here. I encourage you to pick up Straight to the Top and Beyond. I encourage you to add this to your collection. It's not every day that you get to listen to a man who successfully led an expedition to Everest. We're in for a real treat. You're in for a moving, motivating, and exciting presentation by a true adventurer and explorer. Please join me in giving a real Rocky Mountain welcome to Mr. John Amatt.
Thank you.
Cheers.
That was a great introduction, Joe. I never had one quite like that. Maybe you can come and speak at my funeral or something like that. Eh? That'd impress people. Thanks. No, it's great to be here. I'm really enjoying the weather. My wife and I live in the Canadian Rocky Mountains near Banff. I don't know if many of you know that place, Banff, Lake Louise. And the day we left, we drove down in our camper van. It took us 5 days to come down. The day we left Banff, it was snowing. So we're really enjoying the Colorado weather. We're heading from here up to Beaver Creek, and then we're going to head back again after that. It's really an honor for me to be able to speak to audiences around the world, to share some of my experiences, some of my stories, some of the things I've learned about myself and about what it takes to achieve success in life. And it's all built around the metaphor of Everest, if you like. This is Everest, incidentally. This is the summit of Everest. It's actually a painting that was created from a photograph after we came back from that expedition back in 1982. When I came back from Everest, I was unemployed. I had no work. I'd spent 5 years organizing this expedition. We'd had to raise a lot of money. I was unemployed. And I said to my wife, Peggy, I said, what are we going to do? What am I going to do now? We've finally climbed this mountain. And she said in a very innocent statement, she said, well, you finally climbed Everest after all these years of dreaming about it. Now it's time to go one step beyond Everest and to take that story and share it with people around the world. And we formed a company called One Step Beyond Worldwide. And in fact, I just came back from New Zealand where I spoke to 2 groups, and that was my 49th country. And hopefully I'm going to India next year to make it 50. So here's Everest. It's the ultimate goal for mountaineers, and it also is that metaphor that we all aspire for in our lives. We all have those Everest goals to climb. But the real Mount Everest was first attempted, as Joe has mentioned, by this somewhat oddly clad group of British mountaineers who went to the mountain in 1924 dressed in things like Harris tweed jackets. They had scarves wrapped around their necks. Their boots were leather, no insulation. The tents had no effective way of closing the door. The zipper, of course, hadn't been invented in 1924. They'd very often wake up in the morning covered in snow. And they were carrying oxygen cylinders made of solid steel, so that perhaps the negative effect of the weight of the steel was offsetting whatever positive benefit they could get from breathing that oxygen. But despite all that, on that first ever attempt back in 1924, they almost went all the way to the summit. Two of them were last seen at 28,000 feet. They disappeared in the clouds. They were never seen again. And in fact, there is some speculation that it may have reached the summit in 1924, and that would have been 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing in 1953. One of the men who disappeared was George Lee Mallory, the man you see on the back row, second from the left, wearing the white shirt. As was mentioned, he is the man who said, "Because it's there," when he was asked by a journalist why he wanted to climb this mountain. But he also went on to explain with these words. He said, "If you cannot understand that there is something in us which responds to the challenge of this mountain and goes out to meet it, that the struggle is the struggle of life itself, upward and forever upward," then he said, "you won't see why we go." What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy, and joy is, after all, the end of life. We do not live to eat and make money. We eat and make money to be able to enjoy life. That is what life means and what life is for. George Mallory called Everest the struggle of life itself, upwards and forever upwards. And of course, it is in that struggle to climb higher, to be better, to learn more about ourselves, it's in that struggle against difficulty that we rediscover the real potential that lies hidden within us. I am the man I am today because at a very early age growing up in England, I was intensely shy and insecure. I lived in a very protected world. My dad was a senior bank executive, a very conservative profession in those days. My mum, a full-time homemaker. She was always there when I needed support. And as a result, I had no confidence. I was protected from any adversity. And I can still remember waking up, I can still remember an early family holiday. We were driving around in the car. We had got lost. And my dad's sitting in the driver's seat, I'm sitting in the passenger seat next to him, and Dad says, "John, get out of the car and go and speak to that man over there. Go and speak to that man and ask him for directions how to get back to our hotel." And I was so intimidated about the idea of speaking to that one stranger that I absolutely refused to even get out of the car. It's interesting now to reflect upon the fact that I now make my living effectively speaking to strangers. I've created a strength out of what had been that limitation by acknowledging the limitation and by challenging myself against increasing difficulty on mountains all over the world. Of course, having climbed the highest mountains in the British Isles, we had to start looking further afield for more challenges. And at the age of 20, we traveled to Norway, where we'd heard about this mountainside called the Troll Wall. The trolls are the mythical giants of Norway. So this was the wall of the giants in Norwegian mythology. And it was said to be 5,000 feet absolutely vertical. In fact, there were stories of people who had hiked up the back of the mountain, had laid on their stomachs looking over the edge, had pushed huge boulders off into the void, and noticed how those rocks fell vertically through the air without touching anything until they arrived in the valley floor 1 mile below. At this point, nobody had climbed the Troll Wall. The expert climbers in Europe had come to look at it and said it was impossible. It couldn't be done. It would have to wait for another generation of climbers. But when you're 20 with something to prove, an idealism, an ambition, anything is worth a try. And we decided for the first time that we were going to try to climb the Troll Wall. And I think that was the breakthrough that we were able to bring to this challenge, is that for the first time we were willing to try to do something that the experts said was impossible. I can still remember trying to sleep the night before the climb was to start, at the bottom of this huge black mass stretching up into the stars. We could hear stones whistling down the darkness, rocks that were landing 150 feet away from the base of the cliff. And for the first time, we were realizing not only was this vertical for a mile, in fact, it was overhanging for a mile. Trying to sleep our minds a turmoil of fear and anxiety, worrying about all the things that could go wrong up there, but knowing at the same time that unless we found the courage to start the climb the next day, knowing that unless we did that, we would never discover if we were up to that challenge. You know, when we feel fear and anxiety, as we always do, when we're moving from the comforts and predictability of the known world of our previous experience into that uncertain, unknown world of future challenge, when we feel that anxiety, it's critical we move towards it and confront it. Because when you confront fear, it recedes in front of you. When you run away from fear, I think it only grows in your mind. In fact, I believe now that fear and anxiety is just nature's way of focusing our attention on the task at hand. And if we're not feeling somewhat anxious in this rapidly changing, uncertain world of today, if we're not feeling anxious, we're clearly not paying attention to what's going on. We're clearly not focused on the goal. We were able to overcome that anxiety and start the climb. In fact, over the next 10 days, we were able to make the first ever ascent of that vertical mile. And we slept on ledges such as you see here on the right-hand side. In fact, if you can imagine, that was the biggest ledge that we saw on this whole 5,000-foot climb. And I can tell you in a situation like this, you know which side of the bed you're going to get out of in the morning. There's no debate about that. It's kind of funny, you know, when people see these pictures, they become intrigued with questions like, how do you go to the bathroom in a situation like that? Well, it's really quite simple. You kind of let it all hang out, you lean back, and you make sure there's nobody underneath at the time. I think it may have been the highest outhouse in history as we climbed higher and higher. But you know, as we climbed higher and higher, we started to notice something interesting was taking place on this mountainside. Because on the first and the second and the third day, we were very much intimidated by this vertical world. We'd just come from the horizontal world of the valley. We were more familiar with walking around with our hands in our pockets in total balance, and now we're hanging on with our fingers and our toes, and it was intimidating to say the least. But by the fourth and the fifth and the sixth day, as we climbed higher, we started to realize that we were becoming more comfortable up here. We'd overcome the anxiety, we'd open up our minds to the possibilities, we were adapting and learning as we climbed higher. And then, of course, by the 7th and the 8th and the 9th days, we looked straight down from 4,000 feet beneath our heels. We realized now that the danger up here had, in fact, become one of complacency. You know, I don't think taking risks is the real danger in life. Because when we're taking risks, we're anxious, we're paying attention, we're fearful a little bit. It's when we start to operate by habit, when we start to do things over and over again without asking the question why. It's when we fall into the trap of complacency, that's when the danger occurs, because that's when the mistakes can start to happen. And as we climbed higher towards the summit, we had to fight off that natural human tendency towards complacency. And finally, on the 10th day, we're able to stand on the top of that vertical mile. Having achieved a climb at the time that the experts said was impossible, but now, of course, has become a classic in mountaineering, and many, many people climb this mountainside every year. We opened up the door. We proved it could be possible, and many people followed us through. But you know, you don't learn anything standing on the summit when the climb is over. You don't learn an awful lot while you're struggling to get to that point of achievement because you're just too focused on doing the job. The learning takes place afterwards, when you can step back and reflect, digest the experience, learn the lessons. And my learning was perhaps best defined in these words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who said that you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. She says the danger lies in complacently refusing to face the fear, in not daring to come to grips with it. She says you must make yourself succeed every time. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. When you're faced with a situation where the outcome is in doubt, where you're not sure you've got the resources to compete against that challenge, she says you must do the thing you think you cannot do. Because only by doing so do you gain the strength, the courage, and the confidence that comes from every experience in which you really stop to look fear directly in the face. Aldous Huxley, the writer, also said experience is not what happens to you. He says experience is what you do with what happens to you. Whether you take an experience, whether you reflect upon it, whether you learn the lessons, and then whether you apply that newfound knowledge to an even more difficult challenge in life. Because we only grow by increasingly challenging ourselves against increasingly difficult objectives. And it was that experience for me on that mountainside in Norway at the age of 20 that opened up if you like, a crack in a door of possibility that many years later was to take me to Mount Everest as a leader of that first Canadian team some 30 years ago. You know, you don't just pack a bag and go and climb this mountain, of course. It took us 5 years to plan and prepare. We had to assemble 20 tons of equipment and food, $1 million of financing. We flew all the way around the world to Kathmandu, Nepal, embarked upon a 150-mile walk that over the next 3 weeks would take us to the base of the climb, where the real climbing begins. From this point at 18,000 feet, in fact, it takes an additional 6 weeks to climb the final 11,000 feet to the top of the world. And the reason is the higher you go, the more difficult the environment becomes. In the picture, you'll see what appears to be a cloud over the rocky pyramid, which is the highest point on Earth. In fact, that is a plume of snow being blown off the summit for over 2 miles into Tibet by the 100-mile-an-hour jet stream winds that were raking the peak on that perfectly clear blue sky day. As you go higher, the air is getting thinner and thinner. By the time you're pushing for the summit, you're getting probably a quarter of the oxygen into your body that we could expect right here at 5,000 feet. And that means everything you do up there takes 4 times longer than it would right down here. Every thought, every conversation, every step forward takes longer and longer as you go higher and higher. And because the air is becoming increasingly thin, it's also becoming increasingly dry, and you start to dehydrate from your wet body into that dry air. Every time you breathe out, you're losing moisture through your breath. Every time you perspire, despite the cold, you're losing fluids. There's even an evaporation taking place through the pores of the skin. You start to lose 4 to 6 liters of liquid every day from your wet body into that dry air. And over the period of the climb, of course, that translates into a substantial loss of weight. In fact, every one of us was to lose between 20 to 30 pounds during the 6 weeks that we were on this climb. You might be thinking, what a great place to go and lose weight. And it really is a great place to go and lose weight. But the problem is, as you go higher, you're getting weaker and weaker. And the challenge of Everest, now, you know, this is why I think Everest is such a powerful metaphor for the times that we live in today. The challenge of Everest, therefore, is to keep going in the face of an increasingly unpredictable and challenging natural environment while your physical and mental resources are being diminished on a day-by-day basis. And isn't that metaphorically what life is about today, to keep going in the face of increasing uncertainty, moving from the known into the unknown, while the things that we used to rely upon in the past don't seem to be working quite as effectively as they did anymore? You know, we knew in planning this expedition that we had the strength to climb this mountain. As mountaineers, we had the strengths. We'd climbed the highest mountains in other parts of the world, but this was Everest. And we knew we had a limitation in the sense that we could not adapt to the environment as well as the native Sherpa people of Nepal, an indigenous race of people who lived their lives at altitudes of up to 12,000 feet above the sea. They're perfectly adapted to those elevations. And we knew to climb this mountain, therefore, we would have to create a team where the strengths of the Sherpa people would offset our limitations as Westerners, where our climbing ability and their adaptive ability together would make it possible for us to go all the way to the summit. And that was what was to pay dividends later in the climb, as you will see. You know, we thought that we had committed to this challenge 5 years before when we started organizing in the comfort of our homes, but none of us understood what the word commitment meant until we met this gateway section of moving ice through which we now had to pass. This is called the Everest Icefall. And as the name suggests, it is ice literally falling down the mountain. It's ice falling down the mountain at the rate of maybe 2 to 3 feet a day, but it doesn't move at a consistent speed. Some days it doesn't move at all. Maybe 4 or 5 days it may not move at all as the accumulating snow builds up above it, and then all of a sudden on the 6th day a whole section might lurch forward 20 feet in 1 second. And it's at times like that that tragedy can and does occur on this mountain. But you can never predict when that's going to be. You can only say to yourself, this is the gateway through which we have to pass. This is the door that we have to open, and through which we have to establish a route along which we can carry 8 tons of equipment up the mountain on our backs to provision the 4 campsites that must be put into place before the lucky people can get to go to the summit. And I say lucky, because on this expedition, because it was the first time Canadians had tried to climb this mountain, on this expedition the objective was to get 1 person on the top of the mountain. It didn't matter who that person was, because in our definition of team success, when 1 person reached the summit, the entire team would have achieved the goal. And in the early days, we all had to work hard carrying gear backwards and forwards through this broken ice. We didn't know who that lucky person was going to be. But we had to rush up in the morning carrying gear, down in the afternoon, over and over again for many days while we carried all those provisions up to the first campsite. Of course, we tried to minimize the dangers by fixing ropes, by carrying ladders to bridge crevasses. We even started getting up in the darkness in the morning, theorizing in the cold of the night that the ice would be more bonded and frozen together. And I can still remember waking up in that comfortable tent at base camp. Of course, that was the safe place we could always come back to below the dangers. You know, security is important, but I think it's only important as a base, a place to come back to at the end of a day when you've been out there pushing forward, challenging yourself, knowing you can come back to recover in that secure place. And base camp was our security. I remember waking up in that comfortable place and sometimes doing the thing that I really didn't want to do, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, leaving that security behind, to stagger across the broken terrain into the kitchen tent to try to get those precious liquids back into my body to offset the dehydration. And then leaving that behind and going on out into a world of darkness, a narrow world lit only by the beam of a headlamp. And as we climbed through the ice in the dark, I can still remember feeling the creaking and the groaning of the ice under my feet as I climbed. I can still remember seeing cracks appearing in the snow that hadn't been there the day before, noticing how the ropes were stretching under the tension of that moving ice, seeing ladders that had become warped and bent by the pressure of a crevasse closing from both sides. And I remember realizing that even at night, this was not a safe place in which to be. But we had no other alternative but to keep moving. This was perhaps the most dangerous place on the whole climb. It was the safest place we could find to go, but it wasn't safe by any stretch of the imagination, because as we crossed these blocks and stepped across the cracks, we could look down to our feet, and we noticed that down below there was a big hole, probably 30 feet deep. We were, in fact, crossing a bridge of blocks jammed in the neck of that crevasse, and as that ice inexorably moved downhill, we knew there would become a day when this crevasse would open up, the blocks would fall in. And if we were there at that time, there could be some kind of a tragic outcome, but we could never predict when that would occur. We'd rush through it in the morning, down in the afternoon, over and over again. And after 2 weeks, we finally had enough equipment at 20,000 feet to occupy our first campsite, the first of 4 that we would need to put on the mountain before we could go to the summit. The day we occupied Camp 1, in fact, was a great day for the team, because after 5 years of planning, after 3 weeks of walking, after 2 weeks of climbing, we had this somewhat tenuous toehold established on the side of the mountain. At this point, everything was going well, and because everything was going well, I think we may already have started to slip into that trap of complacency. When I look back today, I think we were starting to reflect upon the glory of the achievement to come. If you like, looking towards the summit with tunnel vision, when in reality we should have had peripheral vision. We should have been looking around us on the mountain and adapting to that changing environment on a day-by-day basis. Because everything was going well, we had already fallen into that trap of complacency. And we had entered into what was to be the most dangerous time of the climb without even realizing it. That night, as you can see, a major storm blew in at 20,000 feet, heavy snow, strong winds up there. Amazingly, at base camp 2,000 feet below, no snow, no wind. And as we always did, 15 of us got up in the darkness to carry provisions to the men who were waiting above. And those of us who were on the mountainside that morning will not soon forget what was to occur, because on a very eerie, misty day, just as dawn was breaking, we heard an avalanche break away from the slope of Everest above our heads. This in itself wasn't unusual. We'd heard many avalanches, but this one was clearly bigger. We could hear the noise roaring down towards us, but because of the mist, we couldn't see where it was coming from. The noise, in fact, was echoing around and around the valley. There was nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to avoid this danger. Finally, we were hit by that blast of wind. As the avalanche was falling, it was pushing huge blocks of ice ahead of it, and it was pushing the air out of its path. We were hit by the blast of wind, picked up, thrown through the air until the climbing ropes came tight. And then out of the mist came this bowling mass of snow and ice, and it cut right to the line of 15 people, burying 7 of us who were on the mountainside that morning. The survivors immediately started digging the debris. We found 4 people, were able to dig them out and save their lives. But tragically, in this incident, 3 of our native Sherpa porters had been moving together along the fixed lines and were now missing at the very point where the snow and ice was at its deepest. It took us 3 hours to dig down through that debris, and finally, after 3 hours, we found a backpack, and behind the backpack, we found the body of Pasang Sona, a 40-year-old mountaineer who'd been to Everest many times before, a man who knew the dangers of this climb, a man who'd accepted personal responsibility for the consequences of his decision to go back on this mountain, but also, of course, a man who was a father, a husband, a sole provider for a Nepalese family. And after 3 hours of burial, he was dead. We tried everything we could to bring him back to life, but 3 hours was just too long. We never did, in fact, find the bodies of those other 2 men. To my knowledge, to this day, they still lie buried in that ice, and as that ice inexorably moves downhill, there will become a day when those bodies will appear as the ice melts, and at that point, they will be cremated, just as we now had to prepare to cremate the body of Pasang Sona. The Sherpa people are Buddhists. They believe in reincarnation, life after death. They believe the body has to be cremated to release the spirit for the journey into the next life. The monk came up from the monastery. We had wood brought up from the valley below. We had to steel ourselves for the events that were now to transpire, believing in our hearts that perhaps we were to blame for this tragedy. In the West, when something goes wrong, we always have to have a reason. We always have to have something or somebody to blame. And we were blaming ourselves, saying if we hadn't been so selfish as to want to climb this mountain, these men will still be alive to this day. But the Sherpas, being Buddhists, believe in karma. We might call it destiny or fate. And they came to us now and they said, effectively, they said this was just one of those things. They said this was meant to be. They said if Pasang Sona hadn't died here today, he would have died somewhere else today because this was his day to journey on into the next life. They never once suggested anybody was to blame. In fact, they encouraged it to continue with the climb. And despite the tragedy, we decided we would, in fact, give it one more try. And in fact, on the day of the cremation of the Sherpa, we sent a team of volunteers back up onto the mountain to repair the damage to the route that had been caused by the avalanche. It was on that day, 2 days after the first accident, it was on that day on this ladder in the ice that a second accident occurred in which one of our climbers was to die under a collapsing block of ice. This was that place I described earlier when I said we'd been crossing the bridge of blocks jammed in the neck of the crevasse, and down below was the big hole. On the day of the second accident, there were 4 people passing through this very precarious place. Blair Griffiths was climbing the ladder in the foreground. 3 feet below him, looking up and waiting his turn to climb, was Rusty Bailey. And over to the right were 2 more people, Dave Reed and one of our native Sherpa porters. There were 4 people in this very precarious spot when at the worst possible time, the pressure from above forced that crevasse forward. The bottom literally dropped out of the world of these men as all the blocks fell into the hole. And tragically, Blair, who was on the ladder, was crushed and killed instantly by a block of ice that rolled on top of him. 3 feet below, Rusty Bailey saw that happen right in front of his eyes. But he was untouched, and he was able to jump from block to block as all the ice collapsed into the crevasse, and he was able to survive. But Dave Reed, who'd been over on the right, wasn't so lucky because he lost his balance. He said later he fell head first down a roller coaster into this big blue hole, but he said when he hit the bottom, he was upright. He found himself trapped. His feet were tangled up in the rope, his left arm was wedged against the crevasse wall, and he said quickly he was buried up to his neck by all the debris that fell down on top of him. His right arm was free, his head was free, but apart from that, he said he couldn't move. He told us later as he looked up to see how he might escape, he was horrified to see 2 blocks of ice collapsing towards him, and he was convinced at that moment he was about to die. But just before the blocks reached him, they bumped together, formed a roof about 10 feet above, and there he was now buried alive, unable to move, as far as he knew, the only man to survive this situation. Well, his initial reaction, as you can imagine, was sheer panic. Everybody would panic in a situation like that. But after he overcame that emotion, he started to think about how he might stay warm in this cold place. As he'd fallen, he'd lost his hat, and as many of you know, we lose vast amounts of body heat through our heads. He knew he'd have to find some way of covering his head if he was going to survive for very long. And he told us later that as he looked around him on the snow, he said he was surprised to see a red hat lying nearby. We all had the same kind of expedition hats, so he assumed that was his. And with his free hand, he reached over to pick it up to put it on his head. And he said as he As he lifted the hat out of the snow, he said he was amazed to see some black hair in the snow where the hat had been, and he realized for the first time his companion was buried right up the top of his head in the snow. With his free hand, he was able to scrape the snow away from the face. He was able to pull on the chin. The Sherpa spat out snow and ice. His lips were turning blue as he spat out snow and ice, started to breathe, and then seeing where he was, started to panic. And at that point, the two of them were almost fighting in this quicksand of snow and ice. And it was at that moment that Rusty Bailey heard the noise. Rusty being the man who stayed on top of the debris. All of a sudden, heard the noise coming out of the ice beneath his feet. Well, to cut a long story short, Rusty was able to lower a rope, and they were able to escape. And the real significance of this story, I think, is that that night the three survivors went back down to base camp, to that safe, secure place where they could recover below the dangers. And in that very emotional time, where he had literally been within inches of losing his life that day, in that very emotional time, Dave Reed made a decision to quit the expedition. He said, I'm going to go home where it's safe. And I think we can all empathize again with the turmoil that must have been going on in his mind only hours before he'd almost died in the base of that crevasse. But 2 days later, he was to change his mind and go back on the mountain. And subsequently, in fact, he nearly went all the way to the summit. I think it took him those 2 days to divorce himself from the emotion of that incident. I think it took him those 2 days to learn the lessons from that experience. But most importantly, for me anyway, it took him those 2 days to dig deeply within his soul to find the resources to recommit to this challenge. And in fact, he later told me that the single most important factor in his decision to go back on Everest was the realization, he said, that his father would have expected him to keep going in the face of that adversity. This 36-year-old man went back on Everest because he realized his father would have expected him to do so. What I think he's talking about here, of course, is one of his basic values or his lessons that were taught to him by his parents during childhood. And one of those was that you do not give up in the face of adversity. You know, if you've set a goal for your life and it's a tough goal and you've evaluated the risks inherent in the pursuit of the goal and you found those risks to be acceptable and you found the courage to overcome the anxiety and the fear and you're moving along the path towards the goal, then just because something goes wrong is no reason to abandon the quest. Our commitment to our goals is rooted in our values and in our beliefs. And that's why I think as individuals, as citizens, as companies and organizations, that's why it's so vital we must have common values and beliefs that we can articulate and discuss and apply as we face the adversity of the changing times to come. For the second time in 2 days on the mountain, we had to bring down a friend and a colleague who only hours before had been with us. For the second time in 2 days, we had to build that funeral pyre of wood brought up from the valley below. We had no other choice. We were 150 miles away from civilization. The weather was so bad that helicopters couldn't reach us. We had to steel ourselves to go through this all over again, and no words of mine to this day can explain the horror that we all felt at this rapid turn of events. After such a positive beginning when everything was going right, now all of a sudden everything seemed to be going wrong. But as we struggled to deal with this reality, we also came to acknowledge that there was nobody to blame for these tragedies. Nobody could have predicted when an avalanche would fall from 5,000 feet above our heads. Nobody could have predicted when an ice tower would collapse as the ice surged. But we said maybe we're meant to learn a lesson from this situation. We'd literally been hit over the head by a metaphorical 2x4. And as we tried to come to grips with what had happened, we started to ask ourselves a very basic question. And that was, maybe we've been climbing this mountain the wrong way in the first place. We started to think that what might have happened here is that we spent 5 years in the comforts of our homes developing a plan that was based upon a series of assumptions about what it would be like on Everest half the world away. And we got to the mountain, we applied the plan, complacently assuming the assumptions were correct, not checking to see if they were correct. We were so fixated on the glory of the achievement to come, the tunnel vision, instead of having the peripheral vision, checking in, adapting every day to the changing environment. And it was evident to us now, if we were to have any chance of success, we would have to radically amend the plan. For the next 2 weeks, the weather remained bad. We were not able to go up the mountain or back down. But in that 2-week period, we were able to revise our strategy and go back with a smaller team. We had enough equipment and food above the ice fall for 20 people. That had been carried up there before the tragedies. We had 50 people in the climbing party, but we said if we had to keep going backwards and forwards through that dangerous ice, there could be more tragedy. So we said we'll take the best 20, the strongest 20. They can go back up through that ice fall one last time. And they can act as an advance team. And because they're a smaller team, where they can move more quickly, they can sidestep the obstacles, and hopefully we'll still have enough chance to go all the way to the summit. That decision was made. And the second decision was made to close down the route behind the advance team as we went ahead. And that meant as we were climbing higher on the mountain, down below, the icefall route would start to deteriorate. The ropes would stretch and break. The ice would collapse on the ladders. The crevasses would close. But it was the only chance we had of going up to the top of the mountain. It also meant as we went higher, down below, the doorway would start to become increasingly bolted behind us. But given the reality, it was the only chance we could see of having any hope for success. After 5 weeks of effort, we were finally approaching the final 3-foot pyramid, which is the point that you leave your forced campsite and head for the summit. And at this point, we're starting to breathe oxygen from cylinders for the first time. And because we had that life-giving oxygen flowing through our bodies, 3 of our team were finally able to leave Camp 4 and head up towards the south summit of Everest at 28,750 feet. From the south peak of Mount Everest, the picture you see here, you can in fact gaze up the final 250-foot ridge that takes you to the highest point on Earth. And I'd like to pause in my story at this point and tell you another story that occurred at this point back in 1953 during the first ever climb of this mountain. In the early months of 1953, Everest was still virgin territory. Nobody had reached the south peak, nobody had reached the main peak, where these 2 men are standing on the south peak. But in the month of May of 1953, there was a British team trying to make that coveted first ascent. And on about the 20th of May, for the first time in history, 2 of those British climbers reached this point and stood where these 2 men stand, and at that point became the highest that men and women had ever stood on the surface of the Earth. They must have looked up that final ridge and been strongly attracted by the joy that if they went up the final ridge and became the first people ever to climb the world's highest mountain. They knew if they went up that final 250-foot ridge, they'd become world famous. Their names would be on the front page of every newspaper. They knew that nobody ever again could be first. And here they were, only 250 feet away from that glory. But it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they reached this point. And they were concerned about what might happen if they went on and got into trouble. What would happen if they were trapped by darkness? Would it mean perhaps the other members of the team would have to come up to rescue them? Would it mean that the entire carefully planned and implemented team effort that had gotten to this point would now collapse because of their own inherently selfish desire to be the first people on the top of Mount Everest? As you can imagine, they argued, they debated, they discussed what to do. And finally they decided that what they would do is, for the good of the team, was turn their backs on glory and go back down. 250 feet away from making the first ever climb of Mount Everest, these 2 men turned their backs and went back down for the good of the team. And as they went down, they left their spare oxygen cylinders sitting in the snow, 16 pounds of weight each. As they went down, they carefully conserved the ladder of steps that they kicked in the snow that day, and they left ropes hanging on all the difficult and the dangerous places. 2 days later, as we all know, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay climbed up those steps, pulled up on those ropes, picked up that oxygen, and with the extra strength and time at their disposal, became the first people ever to climb this mountain. Now, we tend to remember the names of Hillary and Tenzing, but I guess that there's very few people in this audience who remember the names of the 2 men who turned their backs, Tom Badillon and Charles Evans. You know, when you see one person standing on the top of this mountain, when you see one person attaining any great goal in life, it's essential that we reflect upon the contributions of all the other members of the team who made that achievement possible. Now, on our expedition, the first man to cross this ridge was to be Laurie Skreslet from Calgary. In the early days of the climb, when he was helping to bring down one of the accident victims, he'd fallen and damaged his ribs. Our doctors thought he may have cracked the ribs, so they sent him down to a hospital at 12,000 feet to get medical attention. He was down there for 2 weeks at 12,000 feet, breathing the thicker air, smelling the green grass, eating the good food, getting stronger and stronger every day. Meanwhile, we were about 20,000 feet, pushing forward, getting more and more exhausted all the time. So when Laurie came back, he was now the strongest member of the team. And that's why we asked him to take our final piece of the puzzle to the summit. You know, this kind of a team effort is where everybody has a piece of the puzzle. We all had a piece of the puzzle to put into place at different places on the mountain. Laurie's challenge was to put the final piece of the puzzle into place right on the summit. When he came back, he described the ridge very well. He said it was a knife-edge ridge, huge drops down both sides. Down the right-hand side, he said a 10,000-foot drop into Tibet. Down the left-hand side, a 6,000-foot drop into Nepal. So he said, naturally, we leaned to the left as we climbed across the ridge, leaning, if you like, towards the lesser of two evils to attain the goal. And here we were on the summit. I say we because we were all there in spirit. Clearly, we could not all be there in person, but we were all there in spirit because we'd done our job. We had fulfilled the ambition of getting one person to the top of the mountain. Laurie took pictures of everything in sight, of course, as you can imagine. He said you could see to where the horizon curved, and in fact, you can see the curvature of the Earth's crust on the horizon. He took pictures of everything in sight, the mountains, the panorama, his two Sherpa companions. Then he decided it was time to get that critical picture of himself standing on the top of the world, and it was at that point he realized that he'd run out of film in his camera. Now, this is pre-digital camera days, folks. This is Kodak days. He started to hunt around in his backpack for that little canister of spare film that he always carried, and he realized in the rush to get going in the morning, he'd forgotten to bring any spare film. He never did get a photograph of himself after all that effort. There is a small consolation, though, if you look carefully in the sunglasses of the man on the right-hand side, you'll see a reflection. That's him. That's his summit photograph. It's the only one he got of himself, actually, standing on the top of the world. That's the only way we knew he was there. You know, as I said earlier, you don't learn anything standing on the summit. You don't learn anything from looking at a picture. Everybody would love the picture. You know, the one that goes on the front of Life or Time magazine, the one that hangs on the office wall and becomes a conversation piece. We all love those pictures, but you know, you don't learn anything from looking at a picture. You don't learn anything standing on the summit. The learning takes place afterwards when you can step back and reflect upon the achievement. And then you can cast that new knowledge out into the future. I should tell you, incidentally, I did not stand on the top of this mountain on this expedition. I have never stood on the top of Mount Everest, and I never will. I have no ambition to stand on the top of the mountain. I went to Everest as a leader, saying to myself, if I can do my job as a leader and a principal organizer to the best of my ability, then if we're lucky, we'll get one person up there. And the day that Laurie reached the peak, I was totally fulfilled. My expectation was totally fulfilled, and I would never go back for that reason. But as long as the weather was good, there were other members of our team who wanted to see that view for themselves, and 2 days later, we were able to get 3 more of our 20-man team on the summit. The second group led by Pat Morrow, the man you see here on the left. He is a professional photographer, an adventure photographer. His pictures are published all over the world. But on the summit that day was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 72 degrees of frost, so cold that the battery couldn't charge his camera. He couldn't get a reading of the light to expose the film correctly in that situation. So what he had to do was to take multiple pictures of the same view, each with a different setting of the exposure meter. Now, on a single lens reflex camera, there's a range of settings called f-stops. They go from f1.4, I think, all around to about f32. Only one of those exposure settings can be correct to create the perfect picture. So he had to take multiple pictures of the same view, each one with a different setting of the exposure meter, by bracketing all the exposures, knowing he'd get one, and only one perfect picture. And it was that discipline that brought back some of the best pictures ever taken from the top of the world. Many people have since asked him how he takes these great pictures, and he has a very simple answer. He says, F8 and be there is how you take great photographs. F8 the camera to make sure the film is correctly exposed to the light, and then be there in the right place to click the shutter. It's that simple. But you know, I think there's a whole different meaning in this phrase. And if there's only one thing you take away from this presentation today, I hope it'll be that phrase. Because to me, that is the key to success in challenging and changing times. Because just as Pat Morrow has to F8 his camera to expose the film to the light, so do we have to F8 our minds. We've got to expose our minds correctly to the world in which we live, but then we've got to be there in that world of today to meet the challenges. because the way we did things in the past aren't necessarily working anymore. F8 and B there, to me, is all about the desire for continuous improvement. It's all about what I call positive dissatisfaction, being dissatisfied with my performance, but always looking for improvement. It's about the constant rejection of complacency that limits our progress forward in life. F8 and B there, applied consistently every day, is the key to success in changing times. You know, when I look back today, I realize now there was nothing exceptional about any one of us on this expedition. We were just a group of ordinary guys in pursuit of a goal for which we had the strength to achieve. We had the climbing ability to climb this mountain, but we were just ordinary guys, ordinary mountain climbers. And we knew to climb the mountain, we would have to build a team where the strengths of the Sherpas in adaptation would offset our limitations, where our climbing ability with theirs, this adaptive ability together, would take us to the top of the mountain. And we struggled through the adversity of those 2 days together, the accidents when they occurred. And that built the trust that bonded us together. I think trust is built in teams of people who struggle through difficult times together. We don't build trust when the times are easy. We just take each other for granted. We build trust when the times are hard. And we were forced to struggle through those tragic events, in the process bonded together with trust. And it was that trust that took these two groups of people from opposite sides of the earth all the way to the top of the mountain. So in a sense, this was really just a story about life that happened to occur in the arena of Mount Everest. And we all operate in different arenas of challenge. So the question then becomes, I guess, what can we learn from this? What can we take away and apply in our own challenges today? And I think it's really quite simple. I believe that attitude is the key to success. It's not what happens to you in life that's important, it's how you react to what happens to you. You know, we can have all the skill, all the knowledge, all the education, all the experience in the world, but if we have the wrong attitude in the face of a rapidly changing, challenging world, we are doomed to failure. If we deny that change is taking place, if instead we complacently cling to the status quo of the past, we will get sucked backwards as more aggressive people pass us by, as more adventurous people pass us by. If, on the other hand, we acknowledge that change is the only constant in life, if we, in fact, seek out change, if we create change by challenging the old ways of doing things, then we have a whole different future for ourselves. And I believe it's what I call the adventure attitude that will be so important in the future. Adventure, to me, is not hanging on a rope on the side of Mount Everest. That's just one place where adventurous people can challenge themselves. Adventure is an attitude that we must apply to everyday life, facing new challenges, seizing new opportunities, testing our resources against the unknown, and in the process discovering our own unique potential. You know, there are no magic pills when it comes to success in life. There is no quick fix. There is no such thing called instant gratification. Success and achievement is strictly the process of applying a clearly defined set of principles consistently, day after day, over a long period of time. And when you look at these 9 principles of what I call the adventure attitude, I think you'll agree with me that we all know this stuff. But in a challenging world, sometimes we lose touch with that reality. In summary, I'd like to suggest to you that it will be the visionary people who can anticipate the future and be prepared for it, and the adventurous people who are willing to try new ways of doing those things, they are the ones who will succeed in the coming generations of challenge. Many years ago, a man by the name of B.C. Forbes started a magazine in his own name, and I don't have that picture, I'm afraid. But he talked about the fact that to succeed in life, you had to stick to your challenges. He talked about stick-to-itiveness. Not to allow things to offset you from your path, but to stick to the goal in the final analysis so you can get to that point of achievement. He formed Forbes magazine, as you know. You know, it could be said, therefore, I think, that we're climbing a mountain of change in our lives today. I think that mountain is probably like a Mount Everest of change. The real Mount Everest is actually getting higher, if you can believe it, as the Earth's plates move together and push it up into the atmosphere. It's gone 7 feet in the past few years. So just as the real Mount Everest is getting higher, so I think is the challenge of change, the mountain of change that we're all climbing. But I think it's important to realize as we struggle with that challenge, that we think of it as a great adventure. Because adventure really is a journey with an uncertain outcome. None of us can predict what the future will bring, but if we have the spirit of adventure, if we're willing to try new things, new ways of doing all things, we will succeed and we will reach those goals. So most importantly, as you leave this presentation, remember F8 and be there. But I think also make sure you keep on climbing. Thank you. Good luck.